Bonjour, welcome to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. My name is Abinaya and I am so excited that you have decided to use my course to learn French. As a rising senior in high school, I have been learning French for about 5 years, and I have been a part of my school's French Honor Society for 1 year. I have always been extremely interested in learning French, and this has been possible with the help of my teachers. So through this course, I hope to help and inspire you in your journey of learning French. In this video, I'll be discussing who this course is for and what exactly this course will cover. First of all, this course is generally based off of materials taught in French 2. I do not go over any of the basics, but if you want a review of these topics, make sure to check out my first course, French for Middle Schoolers. Overall, this course is perfect for anyone who has just finished my first course or anyone who is in their second year of learning French. Also, keep in mind that this course is made as a review for anyone who is learning French in school. But if you are a beginner looking to get a head start, this course is also perfect for you. All my videos are formatted in a way that I explain a concept in English so it's clear, go over the concept in French, and finally cover a few examples in French. As someone who has been learning French for so long, I know that the best way to learn a topic is with examples, so I make sure to include several in my videos. Additionally, even when I'm discussing a difficult topic, I keep my videos short and concise so that they are to the point. In this course, I start with simple tenses such as Futur Proche, Passé Récent, and Imperatif. Next, I move on to past tenses, such as Passé Composé and Imparfait. Finally, I go over future tenses, such as Futur and Conditionnel. The main goal of this course is to help you form more complex sentences by teaching you more tenses. With the knowledge from my first course, you will definitely be able to improve your French. I hope you find this course helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Au revoir. Bonjour, welcome to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we're going to learn about one of the simple tenses in French, Futur Proche, which just means near future. First, let's learn about when and why you would use Futur Proche as opposed to just future. You would use Futur Proche when you're going to do something. This is different than future when you will do something. For example, I'm going to eat my dinner is an example of Futur Proche because you are just about to eat dinner in maybe a few minutes. However, I will eat my dinner is an example of future because it is implied that you will eat dinner at a later time. This is just a rough distinction between the two tenses, so you are clear about when to use Futur Proche. Now, let's learn how to conjugate a verb in Futur Proche. There are two parts to conjugating a verb in Futur Proche. First, conjugate the verb aller in present depending on what your subject is. If you forgot how to conjugate this irregular verb, I have a video about irregular verb conjugations in my last course, French for Middle Schoolers Part 1. Second, add on the infinitive form of the verb you want to conjugate. Let's use danser as an example, and conjugate it in Futur Proche for all the subjects. First, conjugating aller in present for each subject, you get je vais, tu vas, il, elle va, nous allons, vous allez, ils, elles vont. Next, simply add on the infinitive form of danser, which is just danser. Your final conjugation for all the subjects is je vais danser, tu vas danser, il, elle va danser, nous allons danser, vous allez danser, ils, elles vont danser. As you can see, conjugating verbs in Futur Proche is fairly simple because you just have to use the conjugation for aller. Now, let's look at a few examples of sentences. How would you conjugate, we are going to buy a gift? The subject is nous, and the verb you are conjugating is to buy, which is acheter. Thus, the Futur Proche conjugation is nous allons acheter. The final sentence is nous allons acheter un cadeau. How would you conjugate the girls are going to swim? The subject is the girls, which is translated to les filles. As you know, this corresponds to the subject elles, and the verb you are conjugating is nager. Thus, the final sentence is les filles vont nager. That's all I have for this video. Make sure to watch it a few times to ensure that you understand how and when to use Futur Proche. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we're going to cover another one of the simple tenses in French, Passé Récent, which just means recent past. First, let's go over when to use Passé Récent as opposed to simple past tense. You use Passé Récent when something just happened before you started speaking. For example, I just ate my dinner would be Passé Récent because it just happened in the past. However, I ate my dinner would be past tense because it is implied that you ate your dinner in the past and not recently. Now, let's learn how to conjugate a verb in Passé Récent. There are 3 simple steps to conjugating a verb in Passé Récent. First, conjugate the verb venir in present depending on the subject. Second, add the preposition de after the first part. Finally, add the infinitive form of the verb. To understand this concept, let's conjugate the verb manger in Passé Récent for all the subjects. First, conjugate the verb venir in present for every subject. Je viens, tu viens, elle vient, nous venons, vous venez, elle vient. Second, add the preposition de after each conjugation of venir. Je viens de, tu viens de, elle vient de, nous venons de, vous venez de, elle vient de. Finally, add the infinitive form of the verb you are conjugating in Passé Récent, which is manger. For the final conjugation, you get je viens de manger, tu viens de manger, elle vient de manger, nous venons de manger, vous venez de manger, elle vient de manger. As you can see, the process of conjugating a verb in Passé Récent is very simple and easy to learn. Now, let's look at a few example sentences. How would you translate the sentence, she just finished her homework? The subject is elle, and the verb is to finish or finir. The conjugation of finir in Passé Récent for elle would be elle vient de finir. Thus, the final sentence would be elle vient de finir ses devoirs. How would you translate the sentence, we just ran? The subject is nous, and the verb is to run or courir. Thus, the final sentence would be nous venons de courir. That's all I have for this video. As you get more familiar with these simple tenses, you will be able to conjugate them quickly and easily. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we're going to talk about the tense imperatif, which is equivalent to imperative in English. First, let's go over what imperatif is and when to use it. Imperatif is used when you want to give a command, give advice, or make a request. Examples of such sentences are be quiet, stay calm, pass the salt. Now, let's learn how imperatif is used in French. Unlike the other tenses, you can only conjugate a verb in imperatif for the subjects tu, nous, and vous. You can't use any of the other subjects. Now, let's learn how to conjugate the er verb manger in imperatif to understand the pattern. First, conjugate the verb manger in present as you normally would for the subjects tu, nous, and vous. You get tu manges, nous mangeons, vous mangez. Next, get rid of the subject in each of these phrases, so you get mange, mangeons, mangez. Finally, the last step only applies to the tu form. Remove the last s from the verb, so you get mange, mangeons, mangez. And that's how you conjugate an er verb in imperatif. Let's quickly go over the steps so you're clear. First, conjugate the tu, nous, and vous form of the verb in present. Second, remove the subject from each conjugation. And third, remove the last s from the tu form, and you have your conjugations. Keep in mind that for IR verbs and RE verbs, step 3 is not applicable. The imperative conjugation of courir would be cour, courant, and courir. And the imperative conjugation of prendre would be prendre, prenons, and prenez. As you can see, you do not remove the last S from the to form, and that rule is only for ER verbs. Let's look at a few more examples to ensure that you understand this concept. How would you conjugate acheter? Achète, achetons, acheter. Notice how the conjugation is the exact same as the present form, but the to conjugation does not have an S. How would you conjugate finir? Fini, finissons, finissez. Finally, how would you conjugate apprendre? Apprendre, apprenons, apprenez. These rules for imperative apply for most regular verbs, but there are some exceptions that do not follow these rules. Follow along as I read out the conjugations for the most common verbs that are irregular in imperative. Avoir, I, ayons, ayez. Être, sois, soyons, soyez. Savoir, sache, sachons, sachez. And vouloir, veuille, vouillons, veuillez. Now, let's look at a few examples so you understand when to use the to, nous, and vous form of imperative. You would use the to form of imperative if you are informally talking to one person. For example, if you said be quiet to your sibling, you could use the to form. Since the verb is être, it is irregular and the irregular form is sois. So the final sentence is sois calme. You would use the nous form if you were talking to a group of people including yourself. For example, most of the time when you say let's in English, you use the nous form of imperative. In the example, let's walk, the verb is promener, which is a regular ER verb, so the nous form is promenons. Thus, the final sentence is promenons. Finally, you use the vous form when you are addressing a group of people or when you are addressing one person but with respect. For example, if you are saying read my homework to a parent, you would use the vous form. In this case, the verb is lire, which is a regular ER verb, so the conjugation is lisez. Thus, the final sentence is lisez mes devoirs. That's all I have for this video. Make sure you memorize the rules for conjugating a verb in imperative and the irregular conjugations. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we are going to learn about Passé Composé, which means past tense in French. First, let's start with when to use past tense. As you already know in English, you use past tense when a single event happened once in the past, and this concept is the exact same for French. As you can see, there are no special rules for when to use Passé Composé, as there were for Futur Proche and Passé Récent. So the only difficult part is to learn the conjugation. Now, let's go over some basic background information about Passé Composé in French. Passé Composé includes an auxiliary verb or a helping verb that is conjugated in present, which is followed by a past participle, which depends on the verb you are conjugating. The auxiliary verb or helping verb can either be avoir or être. Keep in mind that using avoir as the auxiliary verb can be considered standard because you use it for most verbs, while there is a special case for using être. In this video, we will only go over using Passé Composé when the auxiliary verb is avoir, and in the next video, I will talk about when to use être. As I mentioned before, Passé Composé is formed from an auxiliary verb plus a past participle. Let's take it part by part and start with the auxiliary verb. Step 1. Conjugate the auxiliary verb in present, and for avoir, that would be j'ai, tu as, il, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles ont. Step 2. add the past participle for the verb you are conjugating. Before we actually implement step 2, we have to learn how to find the past participle for a given verb. There are different rules for finding the past participle depending on whether the verb is an ER, IR, or RE verb. For an ER verb, you remove the last two letters, or the ER, and you add the letter E with an accent aigu, which is the name of this accent. Let's take parler, which means to speak, as an example, and find the past participle. First, you remove the ER so it becomes parle. Next, you add the E with the accent so it becomes parler. So parler is the past participle of parler. For an IR verb, you remove the last two letters, or the IR, and you add the letter I. Let's find the past participle of choisir, which means to choose. First, remove the last two letters so it becomes choix. Next, you add the letter I so it becomes choisi. Thus, the past participle of choisir is choisi. Finally, for an RE verb, you remove the last two letters, or the RE, and you add the letter U. Let's find the past participle of attendre, which means to wait for. First, remove the RE so it becomes attend. Next, add the letter U so it becomes attendu. Thus, the past participle of attendre is attendu. As always, there are certain verbs that do not follow the regular rules for finding the past participle, but I will go over these irregular verbs at the end of the video. Now, going back to the conjugation of a verb in Passé Composé, let's use the three verbs we found the past participles for as examples. For parler, the auxiliary verb is avoir, and the past participle is parler. So the Passé Composé conjugation would be j'ai parlé, tu as parlé, il, elle a parlé, nous avons parlé, vous avez parlé, ils, elles ont parlé. For choisir, the auxiliary verb is again avoir, and the past participle is choisi. So the Passé Composé conjugation is j'ai choisi, tu as choisi, il, elle a choisi, nous avons choisi, vous avez choisi, ils, elles ont choisi. For attendre, the auxiliary verb is avoir, and the past participle is attendu. So the Passé Composé conjugation is j'ai attendu, tu as attendu, il, elle a attendu, nous avons attendu, vous avez attendu, ils, elles ont attendu. As you can see, conjugating a verb in Passé Composé seems really complicated, but if you follow all the steps, it is extremely easy. As I mentioned before, there are certain verbs that do not follow the regular rules for finding the past participle, so I will read out the most common ones with their past participles. Avoir, être, été, faire, fait, dire, dit, comprendre, compris, prendre, pris, boire, bu, connaître, connu, courir, couru, devoir, dû, écrire, écrit, lire, lu, mettre, mis, offrir, offert, ouvrir, ouvert, pouvoir, pu, recevoir, reçu, savoir, su, voir, vu, vouloir, voulu. These are just some of the most common verbs that you are likely to use in sentences, but there are other exceptions. Make sure you memorize and get familiar with this list because you should be able to recall the past participles quickly when you are speaking in French. I know it is difficult to memorize, but the more you use these verbs in Passé Composé, you will quickly get familiar with the past participles. Finally, let's translate a few sentences from English to French. I ate some cheese. The subject is je, and the verb is manger in Passé Composé. To conjugate the verb, you use avoir in present plus the past participle, which is manger, since manger is a regular ER verb. So the final sentence is j'ai mangé du fromage. We finished our homework. The subject is nous, and the verb is finir in Passé Composé. To conjugate the verb, you use avoir in present plus the past participle, which is finir, since finir is a regular IR verb. So the final sentence is Nous avons fini nos devoirs. They heard a new song. The subject is il, and the verb is entendre in Passé Composé. To conjugate the verb, you use avoir in present plus the past participle, which is entendu since entendre is a regular RE verb. So the final sentence is Ils ont attendu une nouvelle chanson. You ran to school. The subject is tu, and the verb is courir in Passé Composé. To conjugate the verb, you use avoir in present plus the past participle, which is couru since courir has an irregular past participle. So the final sentence is Tu as couru à l'école. That's all I have for this video. I know there was a lot of information in this video, such as the steps to conjugating a verb in Passé Composé, how to find past participles, and the irregular past participles. Make sure you watch this video a few times to ensure that you really understand all these concepts. It can take some time to comfortably conjugate a verb in Passé Composé, but with practice, it becomes much easier. Keep in mind that these verbs, like most regular verbs, use avoir as the auxiliary verb. So check out my next video to learn when to use être as the auxiliary verb. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we're going to learn about when to use être as the auxiliary verb in Passé Composé and the other rules you must follow when être is the auxiliary verb. First, keep in mind that using être as the auxiliary verb doesn't change anything about when to use Passé Composé. Whether the auxiliary verb is avoir or être, the verb you are conjugating is still in Passé Composé, and you use it when you would regularly use past tense. Now, let's learn when to use être. You only use être as the auxiliary for 16 verbs, and these are called the Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs. Although this sounds a little strange, Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp is actually just a trick used to help people remember which verbs to use être as the auxiliary verb for. So the Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs are devenir, revenir, monter, rester, sortir, venir, aller, naître, descendre, entrer, rentrer, tomber, retourner, arriver, mourir, and partir. As you see, each letter of Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp refers to a different verb that is conjugated with être. Now, most of the past participles of these verbs are regular, while a few are irregular. So listen carefully as I read out the past participle for each verb. Devenir, devenu. Revenir, revenu. Monter, monté. Rester, resté. Sortir, sorti. Venir, venu. Aller, allé. Naître, né. Descendre, descendu. Entrer, entré. Rentrer, rentré. Tomber, tombé. Retourner, retourné. Arriver, arrivé. Mourir, mort. Partir, parti. Make sure you really take time to memorize these verbs because when you speak French, you have to be able to conjugate the verb in Passé Composé quickly. Now, let's move on to the conjugation of a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb in Passé Composé. Just like a verb that uses avoir, you have to conjugate the auxiliary verb in present and then add the past participle. In the case of Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs, the auxiliary is être, so the conjugation in present is je suis, tu es, il est, elle est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont, elles sont. However, when the auxiliary verb is être and you are using a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb, you have to make sure the past participle agrees in number and gender with the subject. When the subject is masculine singular, such as il, you just use the regular past participle with no changes. When the subject is feminine singular, such as elle, you have to add the letter e to the end of the past participle. For example, parti would become partie if the subject was feminine plural. When the subject is masculine plural, such as ils, you have to add the letter s to the end of the past participle. For example, partie would become parties if the subject was masculine plural. Finally, when the subject is feminine plural, such as elle, you have to add the letters es to the end of the past participle. For example, partie would become parties if the subject was feminine plural. Keep in mind that aside from just il, elle, ils, and elles, the subjects je and tu might have an e at the end if the person or object you are referring to is feminine. Similarly, nous and vous will always have an s at the end because they are plural subjects, but they might also need an e if the people you are referring to are all female. Now let's conjugate the verb aller in passé composé. First, conjugate the auxiliary verb or être in present. Next, add the past participle. Je suis allé, tu es allé, il est allé, elle est allée, nous sommes allés, vous êtes allés, ils sont allés, elles sont allées. Now, we have to make sure that the past participle agrees in number and gender with the subject. For je, tu, nous, and vous, we do not know if the subject is feminine or masculine. So to symbolize that you might have to add an e, we put an e in parentheses. Je suis allé, tu es allé, il est allé, elle est allée, nous sommes allés, vous êtes allés, ils sont allés, elles sont allées. For il est allé, since il is always masculine singular, we don't need to change anything. For elle est allée, since elle is always feminine singular, we always need to add an e. For nous sommes allés and vous êtes allés, since nous and vous are always plural, we must add an e. For ils sont allés, ils is always masculine plural, so we add an s. For elles sont allées, elles is always feminine plural, so we add an es. Now let's look at a few example phrases with Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs. He climbed. Here, the subject is il and the verb is monter, which is a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb, so you must use être as the auxiliary verb. The conjugation of the auxiliary for the subject is il est, and the past participle for monter is monter. Since the subject is masculine singular, there are no changes that need to be made to the past participle. Thus, the final sentence is il est monté. She stayed. Here, the subject is elle and the verb is rester, which is a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb, so you must use être as the auxiliary verb. The conjugation of the auxiliary for the subject is elle est, and the past participle of rester is resté. However, since the subject is feminine singular, you must add an e to the past participle, making it resté. Thus, the final sentence is elle est restée. I fell. Here, the subject is je, and the verb is tomber, which again is a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb that uses être as the auxiliary verb. The conjugation of the auxiliary for the subject is je suis, and the past participle is tomber. However, the subject is je and is referring to the speaker, or me. And since I am a girl, the subject in this case is feminine singular. I must add an e to the past participle, making it tomber. So the final sentence is je suis tombée. We, a group of girls and boys, came. Here, the subject is nous and the verb is venir, which again is a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb that uses être as the auxiliary verb. The conjugation of the auxiliary verb for the subject is nous sommes, and the past participle is venu. However, the subject nous refers to a group of boys and girls, so it is masculine plural, and you must add an s to the past participle, making it venu. Thus, the final sentence is nous sommes venus. The girls entered. Here, the subject is les filles or elles, and the verb is entrer, which is a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb that uses être as the auxiliary verb. The conjugation of the auxiliary verb for the subject is elles sont, and the past participle is entrer. However, since the subject refers to a group of girls, it is feminine plural, and you must add an es to the past participle, making it entrer. So the final sentence is les filles sont entrées. That's all I have for this video. Make sure you watch this video a few times to make sure that you know the Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs and the rules for gender and number agreement. I know it can be difficult to remember at first, but with practice, you will be able to conjugate verbs in Passé Composé much quicker. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we're going to learn about imparfait, which is just the imperfect tense in English. We will go over when to use imparfait and how to conjugate a verb in imparfait. First, let's cover when to use imparfait. Imparfait is a type of past tense, so it does refer to actions from the past. However, it is mostly used to describe certain features such as health and weather in the past, to refer to habitual actions or actions that you did frequently in the past, to refer to how things were in the past for extended periods of time, and to show a continuous action that is interrupted by another action. Let's look at examples of all of these in English because it can be difficult to understand. If you were referring to the weather in the past and you said, the weather was hot, you would use imparfait. If you were referring to something you used to do all the time as a child or in the past, and you said, every day I played the piano, you would use imparfait. If you were saying, when I was small, I drank milk, the action of drinking milk is for an extended period of time, which is your childhood. So even though it's not a habitual action, you would use imparfait for both the verbs. If you are saying, I was eating when he rang the doorbell, you would use imparfait for the first verb because it is a continuous action that is interrupted by another sudden action that is not continuous. Sometimes there are certain key words in sentences that show you that you should use imparfait, and all these words show continuation of an action in the past. Some of these words are chaque jour, chaque semaine, chaque mois, chaque année, which means each day, each week, each month, and each year, de temps en temps, from time to time, généralement, generally, souvent, often, toujours, always, and tous les jours, every day. Keep in mind that these words and the concepts that I described above are all in the past. So if a sentence is referring to an action in the present, you still have to use present tense as you normally would. Now, before we look at examples in French, let's learn how to conjugate a verb in imparfait. First, conjugate the verb in present for the subject nous. Second, remove the ons from the nous form of the verb. And third, add the imparfait endings depending on the subject. The endings are ais for je, ais for tu, ait for il and elle, ions for nous, iez for vous, and aient for ils and elles. Let's look at the verb parler as an example. First, upon conjugating parler in present for the subject nous, you get parlons. Second, removing the ons, you get the stem of parle. Third, we have to add the endings depending on the subject. Since this is an example, let's conjugate parler in imparfait for all the subjects. So after adding the endings, you get je parlais, tu parlais, il, elle parlait, nous parlions, vous parliez, il, elle parlait. These are the steps to conjugating all verbs in imparfait. And luckily, there's only one verb that has a different stem and doesn't follow steps 1 and 2. Être has a stem of et, and you follow step 3 as usual. So the conjugation of être in imparfait is j'étais, tu étais, il, elle était, nous étions, vous étiez, ils, elles étaient. Now that we know how to conjugate a verb in imparfait, let's look at a few examples. When I was young, I played tennis. Since being young and playing tennis are both actions in the past that happen for extended periods of time, you must use imparfait for both. For the first part, the subject is je and the verb is être, so the conjugation is j'étais. For the second part, the subject is still je and the verb is jouer. For jouer, the stem is joue and the conjugation is je jouais. Thus, the final sentence is quand j'étais petite, je jouais au tennis. Every day I did my homework. Since the word every day, or tous les jours, refers to a habitual action in the past, the sentence is an imparfait. The subject is je and the verb is faire. The stem of faire is fait, so the conjugation is je faisais. Thus, the final sentence is tous les jours je faisais mes devoirs. Each summer, the weather was hot and I was healthy. Since the words each summer or chaque été refers to a habitual action, you know you must use imparfait. Additionally, the second part of the sentence describes the weather and health in the past, so that is another indicator of imparfait. For the first verb, the subject is le temps, and the verb is faire because you always have to use faire when describing weather. So the conjugation is le temps faisait. For the second verb, the subject is je, and the verb is être, so the conjugation is j'étais. Thus, the final sentence is chaque été, le temps faisait chaud et j'étais en bonne santé. When I was sleeping, someone entered my house. In this case, sleeping is a continuous action in the past that was interrupted by the person entering. Since sleeping is continuous and entering is a one-time action, the first part of the sentence is in imparfait, while the second part of the sentence is in passé composé. For the first part, the subject is je and the verb is dormir. The stem for dormir is dorm, so the conjugation is je dormais. For the second part, in passé composé, the subject is quelqu'un and the verb is entrer, which is a Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb. Thus, the conjugation is quelqu'un est entré. If you have trouble with passé composé, make sure to watch my last two videos to review. Thus, the final sentence is quand j'ai dormi, quelqu'un est entré dans ma maison. That's all I have for this video. I know it can be difficult to tell when to use imparfait, and it is one of the hardest things you will have to learn for grammar, so make sure you understand it well. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we're going to use everything we learned from the last 3 videos about tenses in the past to translate some sentences. I will not be explaining the conjugation for each example, so if you want to review the rules for conjugating verbs in passé composé and imparfait, make sure to watch the last 3 videos. In each of these sentences, you will have to decide whether to use passé composé, imparfait, or both. Let's look at some fill-in-the-blanks. Un jour, tu blank des crêpes. In this sentence, you can see that the first 2 words are un jour, which means one day, which indicates a one-time event rather than a continuous action. In this case, you would use passé composé. So the final sentence is un jour, tu as mangé des crêpes. Souvent, elle blank de la glace. In this sentence, the word souvent, which means often, shows that the verb needs to be an imparfait because buying ice cream is a frequent, habitual action. So the final sentence is souvent elles achetaient de la glace. Je blank à Paris. In this sentence, there are no indicators of whether the verb should be in passé composé or imparfait, so we must use the meaning of the sentence. If you translated the sentence to English, it is I lived in Paris. Thinking back to the rules of when to use imparfait, you should recall that you use imparfait to refer to how things were for an extended period of time. Since living in Paris is a long time event, you should use imparfait. The final sentence is J'habitais à Paris. Keep in mind that when there are no indicators, you should think back to the 4 main rules for when to use imparfait, but don't be afraid to use a little common sense. In this sentence, you need to use common sense to assume that living in Paris is a long-term event rather than a short-term event. Tous les jours, nous blank nos livres, mais un jour, nous blank. In this sentence, there are no indicators to show you which tense to use. In the first part, tous les jours, which means every day, shows that reading the book is a habitual, continuous action. In the second part of the sentence, mais un jour, which means but one day, indicates an interruption to a normal action, so it is a one-time event. Thus, the first verb is in imparfait, and the second verb is in passé composé. The final sentence is tous les jours nous lisions nos livres, mais un jour nous avons oublié. Quand le temps blank chaud, vous blank obtenez, mais un jour quand le temps blank froid, vous blank un jeu vidéo. Let's take the sentence part by part. Starting with the first part of the sentence, you have 2 blanks. Since there are no indicators, let's translate the first part of the sentence into English. When the weather was hot, you played tennis. Since describing the weather in the past is always an imparfait, the first blank is an imparfait. The second blank refers to the habitual action of playing tennis when it is hot, so it is also an imparfait. Now let's move on to the second part of the sentence. But one day, the weather was cold and you played a video game. The first blank is still in imparfait because even though the indicator says but one day, weather in the past is always in imparfait. However, the second blank is in Passé Composé because it refers to a one-time event and the indicator shows that it is an interruption to a normal event. Thus, the final sentence is Quand le temps faisait chaud, vous jouiez au tennis. Mais un jour, quand le temps faisait froid, vous avez joué en jeu vidéo. I know this example was a little harder because there were so many parts to the sentence, but make sure to take the sentence in pieces and logically think through each part. In this case, the indicator mais un jour did not apply to weather because weather in the past must always be an imparfait, but it applied to the last verb. So make sure to pay attention carefully to not only the indicators, but the meaning of the sentence. That's all I have for this video. Distinguishing between Passé Composé and Imparfait can be very difficult, but make sure you memorize all the rules and you will soon master the skill. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we will be learning about futur, which is just the future tense in English. First, let's just go over when to use future tense in French. The usage for future in French is the exact same as in English. You use it to refer to actions that will happen. The only confusion you might have is whether you should use futur or futur proche. But as I said in the Futur Proche video, you should only use futur proche for the immediate future, or something that is going to happen. Now, let's learn how to conjugate a verb in future. Verbs in future consist of a stem plus an ending, similar to imparfait. First, let's learn how to find the stem. For most verbs, the stem is just the infinitive form. One exception is that for RE verbs, you have to remove the last E before adding the ending. For example, the stem for manger is simply manger, and the stem for finir is finir, but the stem for prendre is prendre without the E. Another exception is that for YER verbs, the letter Y in the infinitive form becomes an I in the stem. For example, the stem for nettoyer is nettoyer with an I. Second, let's learn the endings for future. AI for je, AS for tu, A for il and elle, ONS for nous, EZ for vous, and ONT for il and elle. Let's look at attendre, which means to wait for, as an example. Since it is an RE verb, the stem is the infinitive without the last E, so it is entendre. With the endings, the full conjugation becomes j'attendrai, tu attendras, elle attendra, nous attendrons, vous attendrez, elles attendront. Before we look at some examples, there are, as always, some exceptions that have different stems. So listen carefully as I read out the most common ones. Aller, ir, avoir, or, acheter, acheter with an accent, appeler, appeler with two L's, courir, cour, devoir, devre, envoyer, envers, être, ser, faire, faire, jeter, jeter with two T's, pouvoir, pour, recevoir, recevre, savoir, sor, venir, viendre, voir, ver, vouloir, voudre. Now that you know how to conjugate a verb in future, let's look at a few examples. I will eat my dinner this evening. In this sentence, the subject is je and the verb is manger. And since it says I will, you must use future. The conjugation of manger for je is je mangerai. So the final sentence is je mangerai mon dîner ce soir. She will do her homework tomorrow. In this sentence, the subject is elle and the verb is faire. Faire has an irregular stem which is fer, so the conjugation is elle fera. Thus, the final sentence is elle fera ses devoirs demain. We will call this afternoon. The subject is nous, and the verb is appeler. Appeler has an irregular stem, which is appeler with two L's. So the conjugation is nous appellerons. Thus, the final sentence is nous appellerons cet après-midi. That's all I have for this video. Make sure to memorize the rules for conjugating a verb in future and the list of common irregular stems. Au revoir! Bonjour, welcome back to French for Middle Schoolers Part 2. In this video, we're going to learn about the conditionnel tense in French. First, let's learn when to use conditionnel. The uses for conditionnel are basically the same as in English. First, you use conditionnel when a sentence in English has the word would in it. For example, if you were saying, I would eat some cake, to convey that you are willing to eat cake, you would use conditionnel in French. Second, you use conditionnel when you're making a request. For example, if you were at a restaurant and you say, I would like some water, you would use conditionnel in French. Third, you use conditionnel when you are addressing someone with respect. For example, if you were talking to a teacher, you would say, I would like to ask you a question, as opposed to I want to ask you a question. So you would use conditionnel in this case as well. Generally, if you use the word would in English, as you do in these three examples, you use conditionnel in French. Before we look at examples in French, let's learn how to conjugate a verb in conditionnel. The conjugation for a verb in conditionnel is similar to future because there's a stem plus an ending. First, you take the stem. Luckily, the conjugation for conditionnel becomes extremely easy once you know future because the stems for conditionnel are the same as the stems for future. Even the exceptions are the same for conditionnel. Thus, it is important to memorize all the rules for stems and the exceptions from the last video because they are necessary for conditionnel as well. Second, add the conditionnel endings. Once again, this is very easy to learn because the conditional endings are the same as the imparfait endings. AIS for je, AIS for tu, AIT for il and elle, IONS for nous, IEZ for vous, and AIENT for il and elle. As you can see, conjugating a verb in conditionnel is very easy because you just use knowledge from previous tenses. Let's take the verb courir and conjugate it in conditionnel. As you know from the last video, courir has an irregular stem, which is cour. Next, add the endings. Je courais, tu courais, il, elle courait, nous courions, vous couriez, il, elle courait. Now that you know how to conjugate a verb in conditionnel, let's look at a few example sentences. I would like some ice cream. Here, the subject is je and the verb is aimer. The stem for aimer is just aimer. So with the ending, the conjugation is j'aimerais. Thus, the final sentence is j'aimerais de la glace. We would like some help. Here, the subject is nous, and let's try with the verb vouloir instead of aimer. The stem for vouloir is irregular, so it is voudre. The conjugation is nous voudrions. Thus, the final sentence is nous voudrions de l'aide. She would visit China. Here, the subject is elle, and the verb is visiter. The stem for visiter is just visiter. So with the ending, the conjugation is elle visiterait. Thus, the final sentence is elle visiterait la Chine. That's all I have for this video. As you saw, conjugating verbs in conditionnel is fairly simple because you just have to use past knowledge. But make sure to get familiar with when to use conditionnel. Au revoir! Bonjour, I hope you enjoyed this course and really improved your French. So what are the next steps? So this course, French for Middle Schoolers Part 2, is for students in their second year of French, and it focuses mostly on tenses. However, if you want a review of the basics, make sure to check out my first course, French for Middle Schoolers. Additionally, if you want to continue learning, make sure to check out my next course, French for Middle Schoolers Part 3. Aside from French, I have another course titled Math for Middle Schoolers, which focuses mostly on algebraic expressions. However, I also have more math courses coming soon, so stay tuned for those. Again, thank you so much for choosing my course and continuing your journey of learning French. I hope this helped and inspired you. Au revoir!